welcome to my Precision Teaching Podcast. My name is Rick Cabina, and it's May 2008. Well, I'd like to start off this podcast with some announcements. I can now say that Catching Up with Journals, the Journal of Precision Teaching Acceleration, 2005 has been printed and mailed out to all Standard Acceleration Society members, or SCS members. And the 2006 journal, as we speak, is being printed, which should also be finished in probably, I'd say, a few weeks, maybe sooner. After that, 2007 will be worked on next, and in August, well, not August, it would be September, late September, early October, hopefully will be finished for 2008, and that will bring the Journal of Precision Teaching Acceleration up to date. Another announcement I'd like to make is recently we had the conference called it's called the Association of Behavior Analysis International. And there, a group of precision teachers have traditionally met and will conduct various Standard Acceleration Society or precision teaching business. And what's really neat about this year is that if you haven't checked out acceleration.org, you really need to, because that site is becoming more and more focused, more and more relevant for, not that I should strike that from the record, not that it hasn't been relevant, it's just that the features and the different applications and tools that are appearing there are much more than have ever been there before. So that's the point I'm trying to make. One of the things you can do is that if you're a Standard Acceleration Society member, you can log in, you can check out your account. Your account will show you how much time you have left. Your account will also show you when you need to rejoin, and that alone is a major improvement. In the past, we have tried mailing out reminders and having it all done electronically, and having people have ready access to it is a very nice feature and a big step forward. At any rate, we had an election, and the election was for a new cast of characters in the executive office. So the president, there was an election for the president, the vice president, and for the treasurer. If you were a member of the Standard Acceleration Society, then you could vote. And I guess I would say that actually having members of a body being able to vote is something that in the past we haven't done quite so well. For example, when we last time we had our elections, it was at the Association for Behavior Analysis, and pretty much people who attended the business meeting for the Standard Acceleration Society where elections were held could vote. Of course, a problem with that is all the Standard Acceleration Society members weren't able to be there, and some people who voted weren't even Standard Acceleration Society members. But that's water under the bridge, and really not a major problem because, of course, last election we had, again, a stellar cast of officers, so no harm, no foul. But being able to look for a systematic process for voting, that's really a sign, a positive sign for the organization, Standard Acceleration Society, and its members. So I was very pleased that that was pulled off. We had, I believe, 50 people voted. Membership, if I'm not mistaken, right now there are 161 paid members of the Standard Acceleration Society. Now that doesn't mean there are 161 people in the precision teaching community, but it's paid members is always a nice a nice number that gives you some insight into the size of the group. So the results are as follows. We elected a new president. The new president is Bill Helzel, and the vice president is Kelly Ferris, and the new treasurer is Regina Claypool Frey. And those folks, I know each one of them, and I would like to congratulate all of the new officers, because the officers do a lot of work behind the scenes that we don't know about, and it's somewhat of a thankless job. They have meetings, they send lots of emails back, and of course, depending on what their position is, whether you're the president, the vice president, or treasurer, there'll be a number of tasks that are specific to those positions. One other announcement I'd like to make, it has to do with the upcoming International Precision Teaching Conference. That will be held in November. I believe it is maybe the first week or second week. I think the dates might be the 6th, 7th, or, well, I should have checked on those dates, but it's a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and it will be held at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And if you would like to just be blown away by some excellent presentations on precision teaching, on standard acceleration charting, that's the place you want to be. But an announcement that coincides with the upcoming conference is that if you'd like to present, then the time for doing that is almost over. The instructions for making a presentation are at acceleration.org, and if you have something that you'd like to present on, please go to the website and look at the information, and by all means, put in a presentation. But of course, if you're not presenting, would still love to see you there. All right, I think that does it for my announcements. As my podcasts grow, I guess, let me take that back. There is one more announcement I'd like to make. I have been trying to line up a cast of people who I will do interviews with, and that's my cue to have my podcasts occur more frequently than it has been. My goal right now is to start podcasting at least once a month, and if there's more interest and more people say, hey, we want some more Rick Cabina on the podcast, then great. I would gladly increase the frequency of my podcasting. So that would be it for the announcements. There is a new component to my podcasting that I'd like to unveil today and this month, and that is a concept review. Each month I will be doing a concept that is in precision teaching or standard acceleration charting, and I will review that concept, talk about it a little bit, and then after that we'll move on to the interview. So, the concept review. Today, I'd like to talk to you briefly about behavioral fluency. And this is something that is part of my research agenda and something that is squarely a concept involved that has come from precision teaching. Now, the genesis of behavioral fluency probably goes back to, as far as I can tell, 6970 with a published paper from Clay Starlin. And other people who talked and did work with behavioral fluency quite some time ago. And when I say quite some time ago, I'm talking about the early 70s, where Eric Houghton and There were others who've done behavioral fluency through the time in the 80s. Carl Binder is another person who's done work with behavioral fluency. Elizabeth Houghton. These are just people off the top of my head, people who have published papers on behavioral fluency. But behavioral fluency is a concept in precision teaching that says when a behavior reaches a performance standard, critical learning outcomes will occur. So, what does that mean? Actually, that concept that I shared with you is the theory. And the theory predicts that when someone reaches a performance standard, and a performance standard is a term that refers to a frequency range of behaviors. So, for example, typing. If I can type 60 words per minute, between 60 and 90 words per minute, that performance standard would be indicative of that performance standard means that's my goal, that if I attain that, certain critical learning outcomes will also occur. So the performance standard in behavioral fluency is the range that says, okay, you're there. You have attained what we say is fluency. And what precision teachers have found is that concurrent with that attainment of that behavior, so that performance standard, are critical learning outcomes. 3 critical learning outcomes that have been mentioned are long-term retention, endurance, and application. Other people, well, before I get into that, maybe I can share real briefly what each one of those are. Retention, long-term retention means that after you have stopped practicing a particular behavior, that behavior will still be retained at some level. Let's stick with the example of typing. If I can type at 60 to 90 words per minute, somewhere in there, let's say I can type 65 words per minute. If I stop typing for a month or 2 months or heck, even 5 months, when I go back to typing, there should be very little performance decrement. So I met that performance standard, and one of the outcomes, according to the behavioral fluency literature, the behavioral fluency theory, suggests that I should be able to retain that behavior. Another critical learning outcome that precision teachers say should occur with the behavioral actually I should change that. It's not the precision teachers who are saying it. It's people who are conducting the research to support the behavioral fluency theory. Yeah, that's more precise when I put it that way. But endurance means that you can perform a behavior at a certain level over a given period of time. With the typing example, if you can type at 65 words per minute, or if you're a fluent typist, your performance is going to be very level for, let's say, a minute, or let's say a minute and a half, or 2 minutes. People, when they think of endurance, they think about not fatiguing. So if you can imagine a very steady performance, that's what endurance means. Also, endurance has another part of the definition which says that when you have endurance, you can perform that behavior in the face of environmental distraction. So that fluent typist who's typing at 65 words per minute, if it were me, my daughter can be in the background asking me a question, or the phone could ring, and those environmental distractions aren't going to affect my performance. The last piece of this theory is, well, the last critical outcome that I'm going to discuss is application. Application means if you have a behavioral element to a behavioral compound, when that behavioral element reaches the performance standard, it's much more likely to be able to form a behavioral compound, or to lock in with that behavioral compound. It'll apply to that behavioral compound. Now, if if that behavioral compound has 3 components and you only get to fluency with 1 component, then there's no guarantee that that behavioral compound is going to occur smoothly. It may occur more smoothly if those other 2, depending on those other 2 compounds. Now, if you have all 3 of those compounds at a high level, then those will apply to that compound behavior. Now, something that I did with behavioral fluency is I reviewed the literature and I asked this question. If do we have studies that show the attainment of performance standards predicts a critical learning outcome? If you have read other articles on behavioral fluency, you'll note that some people add other critical learning outcomes. Contingency adduction is an outcome that some people add to the list. Stability is another outcome that I've heard people add to the list. Some people have even talked about fun, and there are just a whole nother list of either critical learning outcomes or behaviors that occur with behavioral fluency. When I reviewed the literature, I wanted to see what critical learning, well, I wanted to ask 2 things. Were these critical learning outcomes occurring, and which ones were they? And what I found through my literature review is that there are 3 critical learning outcomes. This is over 24 studies, 3 critical learning outcomes that have been published in the literature as occurring when people meet a performance standard that is indicative of behavioral fluency. Now, when you have a theory basically is a hypothesis where people have tested that hypothesis with experiments. Some of those experiments may be positive, some of those experiments may be negative, and one feels more confident with a theory the more information that one can obtain on that theory. And of course, if you have a theory and there's very little evidence for that theory, then you're not so sure that that theory is legitimate. So this is how we do basic science. And with the behavioral fluency literature that I have found, having 24 studies, I think that's a very nice indication. Those are a number of studies that say, hey, look, there is something to this theory of behavioral fluency. We need to learn a lot more about it. We need to have more research studies. But I am encouraged by the data that I found. And that article, it's not an article yet. Right now, it's a manuscript that I would say is 75% done. If anyone out there listening to this would ever like a copy of that after I submit it, I would be more than happy to share my manuscript with you once it's complete. So that is a concept review for behavioral fluency, and I talked about some of the evidence. If you have questions about anything that I ever talk about with a concept review, please feel free to email me. And also, if you have other concepts that you'd like for me to discuss, you'd like for me to research or talk about, please let me know, and I would be happy to include those in future podcasts. Now, I'd like to move on to our interview. The interview that I have is, in the past, my past interviews have been with some veteran precision teachers, and I can say I really enjoy my interviews because this is an opportunity to hear how others have been drawn towards our practicing science, our science, our scientific practice, whatever you want to call it. And it's really neat to hear the stories and how people have and are using precision teaching. This month's interview is with an actual teacher, a practicing teacher. So the people I had in the past have been very experienced, whom I would call veteran precision teachers. This month, we have someone who knows a lot about precision teaching, but right now is applying it as we speak. And the person I'm interviewing is Shawn Datchuk. Shawn Datchuk was a past student of mine, and of course, I won't say much more about Shawn because I asked him to talk about his background in the interview. So, without further ado, I present the Shawn Datchuk interview. I'd like to welcome Shawn Datchuk to my Precision Teaching podcast. And for those of you who haven't met Shawn yet, Shawn is a teacher at a school in New Orleans. And Shawn, I had the good fortune of having Shawn at Penn State University last year. And, well, actually, for 2 years, I believe was the time. And Shawn has been working in a school since that time. And welcome, Shawn.
Hi, Rick. Thanks for having me.
So I always like to start off actually, before I get to the interview, I think some people would be really interested in getting a firsthand perspective of, we've all heard of New Orleans, the difficulties it's had in rebuilding, and it would be great to hear a firsthand perspective of, what's your sense of how is that area doing in terms of rebuilding?
Well, first, I teach at a school in Central City, New Orleans, and that encompasses the Ninth Ward, the lower Ninth Ward, which is where the levee broke, and they experienced just a lot of flooding in that area. So definitely parts in the lower Ninth still haven't been rebuilt at all. That's sort of the place where it's picked up a lot of press, at least recently, because that's where Brad Pitt has built those model pink homes in there. And they still have, I don't know whether this is still the case, but it was just a couple months ago that the National Guard is still patrolling the lower Ninth because the New Orleans Police Department's having a hard time getting adequate staffing for that section of town. But in terms of the other wards that sort of we service at our school, it's the educational infrastructure definitely is still at its very beginning stages. Right now, for example, our school shares a building with an elementary school. So we have the third floor, and an elementary school has the first 2 floors. And the logistics of that have just been tricky in terms of when, who has a cafeteria at what time, just intermingling with our students because we're 6th grade, and then since it's an elementary school, they obviously have younger kids, so we just try to minimize their interactions. And that's really the case across the city where it's a lot of modular buildings, and just trying to find a place or a building that has adequate space, and that the things such as the wiring works or the air conditioning and things like that. But the building-wise, it's still very much in the beginning stages, and definitely just in terms of just education here, it's still just starting up.
Well, how about other parts of the infrastructure, such as hospitals? I mean, you mentioned the police force. I mean, are they picking up in those areas? It seems Oh, go ahead.
No. Luckily I haven't had to visit a hospital since I've been down here. Yeah. So I assume that the hospital infrastructure is picking up. My roommate's a pre-med major at Tulane University, and I know when he has to go inside and do rotations, his comments about how severely understaffed they are in the city.
Well, myself and certainly the audience, we salute you, and I think all the people down there rebuilding. I mean, here we are in March of 2008, and what you say is similar to what you hear on the news. So listening to NPR or reading articles in the USA Today, there seems to be you'll find articles or people talking about the good and the rebuilding, but then you also see the criticisms of how there's lots of money that's unspent, there's lots of infrastructure that still needs. So I really am certainly very grateful to you and the service that you do down there. Because being a teacher, I think without having education, that certainly is going to impact any area that's rebuilding. So kudos to you, Shawn.
Appreciate that.
Let me start the interview by asking you, why don't you give us, as I mentioned earlier, you did work with me, but why don't you give us a background on how you got into precision teaching?
I started at Youngstown State University in Ohio, and my first day there, I saw a guy with a big, like, dolly cart, like a furniture dolly cart that had a really squeaky wheel. So when you'd be across campus, you just kept hearing like this real, like, incessant squealing. And then when I looked over, it was just this gentleman in sort of this big American Indian coat and a cowboy hat. And I said, oh, this guy looks pretty interesting. And then later that week, I had to meet with my advisor. And when I walked into the office, it was that same gentleman, which ended up being Dr. Stephen Graff. And he had a big painting inside of his office that had it looked like two aliens that were floating in space, and they were holding this glowing ring, and it was a human was like floating through the ring. And so when I looked at that, I turned to him and I said, oh, that's a real interesting painting. And I started to like laugh a little bit, and then Dr. Graff just stared at me, and it was just like a minute pause where nobody said anything, and then he just sort of went, yep. And then ever since then, I just sort of became hooked, and I was just trying to figure out what was going on with Dr. Graff, and he sort of led me into precision teaching, and I really just sort of fell in love with it there. And I tried to take as many classes as I could with Dr. Graff. So I think I took probably between 5 and 7 classes with him, and then I also did my senior thesis project on standard acceleration charting. So ever since then, it's just been really fascinated with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly for our audience. I don't know if they are aware of this. Some might be, but of course, I share the link with you. And that when I was an undergrad, I also had Steve as an advisor, and certainly, he is a remarkable person. And at the time that I was there, I had never seen him in that, but at the time that I was there, and I think this happened a lot through his career, is he would wear different types of clothes that sort of marked where he was at and his thought processes. And at the time that I was there, he was the coach, and he would wear these shirts that said the coach on it, and he had his thought back then was that it was really useful to think about in terms of teaching more as in coaching people along, and I always liked that. And in fact, it took me a number of years to stop calling him coach, because that's how you know people. But yeah, that's really interesting. So you went to Youngstown State, then you worked with me for a couple years, and that brings you to your current job in New Orleans. It's college. What is the exact title of the school again?
The full title is New Orleans College Preparatory Charter School, and we just call it New Orleans College Prep.
Okay. And what do you do at your school?
Well, we're a first-year charter school, so we only have a 6th grade, and that's roughly about 100 students. And I'm the the only special education teacher they have on staff. So what that means is I sort of run the special education department, I guess, for lack of better terms. So I just sort of establish that we're following compliance with the Individuals for Disabilities with Education Act and Louisiana's interpretation of that. Line up all related services such as speech. I teach. Currently, at the beginning of the year, I taught reading decoding classes. Now I sort of branched off and do math classes, writing, and I still have reading. I have reading decoding, and now I have a reading comprehension class as well.
And in those classes, have you had the opportunity to apply precision teaching to those topics?
Definitely. For example, I have our reading decoding class, where we use SRA materials. We use SRA decoding B2, level B2 in this, and we set up our classroom through the recommendations of that wonderful article by Kent Johnson and T.V. Joe Lang in the American Psychologist, the Structuralist Barrier one.
Ah, yes.
Mm-hmm. Where they have the instruction area, a fluency center, a free time area, and sort of this, and then we sort of have this workbook area as well. And so I have a really great teacher assistant, Julia Trexel, and she sort of runs the fluency center. So after the group instruction, when the kiddos break off into their workbooks, she calls people back there to do repeated readings with the students, and we track all of that on standard acceleration charts. And then we also do letter sound and sound combinations, and we track all that with standard acceleration charts.
I am very interested in the logistics of that. That must be something else to pull that off. How do you handle that?
Probably not too well. But I've been really lucky. The teacher assistant we have now, I've had tremendous luck, because she's just extremely willing to go sort of the extra mile, and she really buys into the fact that we need to make data-driven decisions. So what happens, at least with that class, is that we use the timing sheets where we have the consecutive timings, one on there, and then so when a student, once we do the group reading, in sort of this U-shaped pattern, we follow the class rules set by Mr. It's Mr. Maloney with the teacher children well.
Michael Maloney.
Michael Maloney. And he has the 5 class rules in that book, where it's work quickly and quietly, keep your hands and feet to yourself, raise your hand, say only good things, and bring all materials to class. So we really reinforce that throughout every single transition. So when the kids walk back to their desk, it's walk back quickly and quietly. And any deviation from that, we have a school-wide token economy. So you can earn +5 credits, or you could get deductions of -5. So we walk over quickly and quietly, and what that means is that if a student walks over, then he's sort of dancing and popping and locking, then I'm just going to go, okay, that's -5. But if they walk over quickly and quietly, then I go, great job with that. That's a +5 for Brandon, or that's a +5 for Harold. So just reinforcing the appropriate behaviors. Once they sit down, then Miss Trexel starts calling students back one at a time. And during that time, she works on that. She charts their progress on the timing sheets while the student fills out their daily timing record sheet, something from Dr. Graff. And then they do 3 readings. and then she just sort of keeps the rotation going. Some students, that gives me a chance to still work on their acquisition, because if a student displayed difficulties with the word attack or group reading, then I'll hold them off from doing the fluency timings, and then I'll just work on the acquisition, such as letter sounds of, say, OU makes the OW sound, or OL, OI, and then, or if they're having difficulties with a certain error pattern, then I'll work with them on that. And then after that's done, we go through about a 3-day cycle to where we'll use Dr. Graff's Excel charts, and Ms. Trex will help me with the data entry, and then we'll sort of sit down for roughly about 20 minutes and look at the standard acceleration charts, and then see what interventions we have to try. The biggest thing that we've noticed so far is just an endurance issue, especially with a lot of these kids coming. I think this is really the first time where they've had an emphasis on reading accurately and quickly at the same time. So looks like starting next week, we're probably going to scale back a little bit and do some endurance building with sprinting, such as having them read 30 seconds instead of for 1 minute. So that's sort of at least that's what that class looks like. And then we have a math class where we sort of do a similar thing. And in reading comprehension, we do sort of similar thing where we'll sit down, every 3 days and then see what data we have and then determine what the appropriate intervention should be.
How many students are we talking about in this process? So how many charts are you looking at?
At the beginning of the year, we were looking, so we had 100 students, and roughly 75% of those students were reading at below grade level. So what that meant is sort of the school allocated my time for doing reading remediation. So what that meant is that we have an extended school day from 7:30 until 4, and from literally 7:30 to 4, I was just doing reading groups. And that was about, including Ms. Trexel's groups, we had about 60 students going through that. Excuse me. And what that meant is that I had the students charting their own progress on standard acceleration charts, and I would try to go through the data about once a week at that point, and then make some decisions based on that. Currently, right now, what we have is we have 3 students in a reading comprehension group. We have 9 in the reading decoding group, and in the writing, we have 4. Starting next week, we're going to have 40 students for math. We're starting a sort of a big math initiative, and we're looking to get those students on standard acceleration charts as well. But so for right now, what is that? That's probably about 25 kids, and then once we add on the math groups next week, it's going to be about the 50 to 60 charts going.
That's excellent. Let me ask you, I remember having a conversation with you before where I think you were looking to try and see if some of the students could do some charting themselves. Did you ever have a chance to follow through with that, or is that on the docket to happen?
I did. That happened during the reading decoding group, and we did. So the students did their own charting with that group, and it took me. Let's see. I followed the guidelines. I believe that I can't remember, Rick. I think that when I emailed you, you sent me a template of recommended allocation.
That template was actually from Michael Maloney. I just adapted it. So, props to Michael.
Yeah. And then so I basically followed that, and I deviated from it a little bit in terms of so my first lesson was the longest, and then I really did sort of these follow-up mini lessons for about 10 to 15 minutes a day for 5 days. And then after that, the kids were just on their own charting.
And so it was successful? It worked?
It definitely worked. We it the only thing that I found trouble with is when the kids were absent, um, or if a kid was suspended. Just trying to catch them up on that
Mm.
was a little difficult, especially because we have an after school tutoring time too, and just finding the time to do that with them. So for when I teach this again, I just need to work out finding a time during the class to catch up kiddos who are absent. But other than that, I mean, it was the kids really enjoyed seeing their progress. Especially now, we have sort of like the competitive juices are flowing between the boys, especially in terms of who's reading the fastest,
Mm.
who's getting the most math facts with SAF-Med timings. So I think that once this math group picks up, we're only going to sort of see an increase in that, increase in sort of the buy-in for really going quickly and accurately.
That brings me to my next question. I have been, well, for most of my career, I have been exclusively using the paper charts. And with the advent, when I publish articles in the past, I would say that there have been some templates that I use for professional publications. And now with Steve Graff has the Excel template, and Stu Harder, Scott Bourne, and Owen White had the other version of their chart with their template. And of course, Chuck Merbitz has an online template. So I'm wondering, for the future of our field, where are we going? Will it be a mix of paper? Will it eventually move to just the electronic medium? Or so I'm wondering what your perspective is on that, having to do this.
Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, we're doing the shift towards the computerized charts,
Mm-hmm.
and I, for us at least, it's really just a time issue. It seems to be more convenient for us, and I don't know whether this is going to harm us in the end, of just collecting the timings. So just using a daily timing record sheet and just writing out what the hits and what the misses were, and then going in later on and then putting in the best timing later on in the day into an SEC chart. I think I'm trying to be mindful of having the kiddo own the chart and really become invested into it. And with
Yes.
that delay in our actually the performance and us recording it, that delay, I don't know whether that's going to harm any of our buy-in.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, because I guess who I really didn't talk about, who's been doing this for years, is Ian Spence at Ben Braun's. And with their model, immediately after you do it, your chart pops up. So that's an interesting comment that you make, because obviously the chart has so much value in that, not just for us as teachers, but for the students to be able to self-monitor their progress.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine logistically, you don't have your classroom set up where right afterwards they could just go to a computer and plop their score in and see what their chart is.
Yeah, at least right now, I was hoping to. That's the one piece we're missing from the Johnson Lang recommendation for classroom layout. Is they had a little computer station set up in their classroom to where learners could go over and do either remediation or enrichment activities or even charting. And I would love to have that set up to where the kiddos could actually go and do that. But right now, I'm missing the computers. I don't have the computers to do that. And then also, I guess that's really the only thing stopping me from doing that. I would just need the computers to do that.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting how here we are in 2008, how that really unfolds in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting hearing your feedback on how that's transpiring. So With you mentioned that you're doing precision teaching mainly with fluency for reading and math. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm branching off into writing at the moment.
Okay, well, that was my question. I was going to ask if how do you see this branching off into other areas, and what are your thoughts there with writing?
I'm pretty excited about writing, just because my collaboration with the general education writing instructor has really picked up, which I'm really happy about. And what we are doing is we're sort of deciding how we could best help these kids for the rest of the year, because unfortunately what we're looking at right now is a high retention rate. And sort of what that means is that our pupil progression plan dictates that if you fail either reading, writing, or math, you're going to be held back in the 6th grade. And right now that's about almost, a sizable number of our kids are falling into that criteria, to where they are either failing reading, writing, or math. And so what we're doing with our collaboration is trying to help the kids who are struggling in writing sort of increase their writing scores. And what that has meant is sort of a collaboration centered on not only being an accurate writer, but also doing it quickly and efficiently. Mm-hmm. And so she has embraced the idea of getting a frequency measure in writing skills. And so we've used the correct writing sequences.
Correct word sequences?
The correct writing sequences.
Correct writing sequences. What does that mean?
What that means is that it's an analysis of writing on a time measure. So you typically give a student 1 minute for brainstorm and then 3 minutes to write. And in that 3 minutes, we're looking for the student to 1, spell words correctly, 2, use correct punctuation, and 3, make grammatically correct sentences. And you can analyze in between punctuation marks and in between words whether or not that it's a correct writing sequence. So if the student wrote Steve and John was going to the store, it would be correct to say Steve and John were going to the store. And so you can analyze whether or not they had the appropriate past, present, tense, or the appropriate verb usage. And there's the Ames web. Mm-hmm. Has suggested correct writing sequence scores for grade levels. And what we've been able to do is sort of get a baseline collected on our students to see how many correct writing sequences they are using. And then, so that's one facet of what we're using the standard acceleration chart for. And then the second one is that I'm still thinking through this because I ordered a lot of the WIMBY prototype construction materials. Mm-hmm. And I am sort of really interested in trying to figure out a way that I can put kids into a free operant fluency context to use some of that.
That is really exciting to hear you speak about that, because one of the things that I'm looking at, in fact, is writing. And my colleague and I have a grant, and the grant is funded through IES, and it happens to do with writing, and it happens to do with fluency. And what's interesting, maybe I'll share this with you after our interview's finished, but there is an article, a recent article that came out that talks about a curriculum-based measurement in writing, and they looked at what is predictive of writing fluency, what are some, and really what they found out, and of course they looked at a lot of expository, some of the things that we commonly think of for reading. For example, in reading, if you look at how many words per minute someone reads, that's really a good predictor and indicator of writing competence. But when you look at how many words per minute someone writes, that doesn't have a corollary effect. In other words, someone who can just write 200 words versus someone that could write 180, or they look at that, and it's really interesting. And what you're saying, there's another grant that I plan on submitting soon, and it's with one of the people who'll be part of this as a consultant is by a fellow of the name of Steve Graham. And Steve Graham is one of the just experts in writing, and he's at Vanderbilt University. And I had a chance to talk with Steve Graham the last time I was down there on the grant, and we were talking about what would be some really good measures of writing fluency. And sure enough, one of the things that he said, he mentioned sentence combining, and that certainly is something that Wimby and others have looked at, and I don't know, I'm sure a lot of other people have, but certainly that's when I first heard about sentence combining is from Wimby. So I think you're really on to something there. I'd be really interested too, just to see what you come up with, because writing, unfortunately, is the often overlooked skill. So people were really concerned about reading and math, and understandably so. Especially reading has to be the most critical skill I think that you'd want to develop. But writing sometimes gets overlooked. So it's very encouraging to hear what you're doing.
That's interesting that you're working with Steve Graham. I actually forgot about that. I remember you mentioning his name before, and I'm actually basing when I'm looking, because right now I'm on spring break, and when I'm laying out my scope and sequence for what my writing curriculum is going to look like, I'm actually using a meta-analysis by Steve Graham that he conducted with the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So it isn't published in a journal, but he's identified roughly 11 suggested writing interventions, and I'm really interested because one of the identified writing interventions is sentence combining. And at least from when I looked at his citations, it looks like he's using a lot of dissertations to analyze the effect of sentence combining. So I'm interested to see if there's any articles out there, research papers published in prestigious journals that's looking at sentence combining.
Yeah, I don't get the sense that there are books and people that talk a lot about it, but I haven't seen. Of course, I haven't systematically searched for it, but I haven't seen that many articles on it. So that's a good point you bring up. What is the database for this? And it certainly lends itself to precision. Well, Kent Johnson has been doing this at Morningside Academy for a number of years. I don't think he's ever published anything, but there's certainly a lot of clinical educational evidence that this is something that would be really useful. So you're thinking of expanding it into writing. That seems like it's a lot for a year one teacher. You got the PT up with the reading, with the math, and you're looking for the writing. Are you those are pretty much the main areas I imagine that you cover in school?
And then I'm trying to use it for reading comprehension as well, as because it's been, and we talked about this on a telephone conversation previously about, so I have some kiddos in reading comprehension group to where we're really working on just picking up, say, deductions or analogies, picking up their vocabulary as well as that I've noticed that statement repetition.
Yes.
Has been a difficulty that the students have displayed over time at my school. And so I've been using precision teaching on that because I've noticed that when I give them a sentence between 5 and 7 words, the sentence repetition really starts to become difficult. And that's just critically important, especially when I'm trying to get them to use the words maybe or all or none, because if you drop one of those words off in a sentence, it drastically changes the meaning of what you're repeating to me. And so what I've done is I've sort of scaled back. So I said, okay, that's 5 to 7 word sentences. I scaled back to 4 words, and then I sort of broke off and, okay, just repeating 4 words, 4 random words, repeating 3 words, repeating 2 words. And right now, we're at the 2-word slice, and I'm sort of trying to build that up to fluency. And I wasn't able to find any fluency measures with that, so I've just used informal measures of, like I just go into these volleys with teachers at school and different kids, And it seems like, at least informally, it looks like you need to be able, or the fluency, a fluent reader will repeat 90 words to me in 1 minute. So that means 45 of those 2-word volleys.
Wow, that's an interesting insight.
Yeah, so I don't know what that means in terms of being able to impact their statement repetition overall, because I'm still just collecting data on that. But right now, so the kids reached that 2-word, and now we're working on 3-word, and then after that 4-word, and then I'm hopeful that we'll go into the whole sentence here pretty soon when we get back from spring break.
That is, I think, well, from my perspective, that is very exciting to hear that you're moving into comprehension. Oftentimes, when you look at articles and you look at comprehension, people tend to look at the more advanced levels of comprehension. So you give someone a story to read, and they can't make an inference. And oftentimes, although students might not be able to do that high-level skill, if you think about what we know in precision teaching with application being part of behavioral fluency, and really application is an insight that would be similar to other people who look at skill development, the notion that a composite or a compound behavior is made up of elements, and of course with application, if you can get those skills to a fluency or even get those skills at a higher frequency, then that's going to impact that. And so reading, what I don't think people understand is it's so incredibly complex, and there are so many skills that comprise comprehension that you can't look at just one skill, one composite skill, and think that that's necessarily going to pay off. So what you're doing in comprehension, and if you add to that and you start seeing effects, I think is really just some very powerful work. And I'd be real interested to see how that affects. Like, do you do Dibbles measures at all in your school?
We do.
So it would be interesting to see how this translates into some of those Dibbles, because I'm sure what you're doing already is having an impact on the Dibbles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been exciting. Some of the kids that we had in our earlier reading to coding groups, it was really nice to see where they were coming in, where they test into a 2nd or 3rd grade reading level, and they were struggling with all their classes, getting F's or C's. And then after the class, now there are A, B students.
Wow.
So I think that's obviously the ultimate goal for any special education teacher or any learning support teacher, because these kids weren't identified with special needs, is that to give the kids a chance for success in the general education curriculum, I think is the ultimate measure. And then so I was really happy to see that for some of our kiddos, sort of giving them that chance to succeed in those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier, is it 100 students you work with?
Yeah, our school has about 100 kids.
Okay, and you work with students who are identified as special ed and students are Title I, or who comes to you?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, right now I'm the special education teacher, Title I teacher, and just our learning support teacher, which means we really try to take an active response before a kid gets into that pre-referral pipeline. So when a kid starts to struggle in the general education curriculum, we're really trying to keep our need for evaluations to a minimum. And so we're using response to intervention model. So I really just see any kid, I'm really, if you're getting an F at a class, then you probably are going to see Mr. Datchuk at some point throughout the day.
Yeah, that's interesting. The RTI model, for those who aren't familiar with it, response to intervention, is really receiving a lot of attention in our field recently. And of course, in some of the articles, people are still trying to figure out exactly how do we best do RTI, because there's 3 tiers in RTI: Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. And at the first tier, for RTI to work, you're supposed to have access to research-based materials. And the Tier 2 intervention, you'd be looking at some more intensive types of, you wouldn't be identified as requiring special education services. And I think that's an area where precision teaching might be able to play a very big role, which I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Definitely. I don't know. I can't think of any other way to do a high-quality response intervention model without bringing in frequency and the analysis of corrects over errors. And I mean, that's exactly what precision teaching does.
That's an excellent soundbite. I might actually take that and put it in an article. So, Shawn, we're approaching towards the end of our interview. Is there anything I could have asked you, or anything that you'd like to share with the precision teaching audience?
Well, one, if you're thinking about going to, or if you're looking for a job and you're really interested in sort of helping not only kids with special needs, but kids in general receive a high-quality education, please think about coming to New Orleans. We definitely need quality people, and I would welcome precision teachers with open arms if decided to come down to New Orleans.
So you're saying part of the sign-on bonus would be a hug from Mr. Datchuk?
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, I might be leaving Penn State pretty soon here. I have some information on your school that I received. It's a recruitment letter, and on my website with your podcast, I will also have this PDF file there. So anyone who's interested, you'll be able to download that right from my website, and it has information about the school, who to contact, and so on. So I'll have that up on my website.
Oh, excellent. There's also thank you very much. So we have a website, nolacollegeprep.org, and we're really looking to build a high-quality school for kids who typically don't get a chance to go to those type of schools. Honestly, if anybody is interested, I'd strongly suggest checking us out.
And you are 6th grade, and you mentioned you're going to be expanding to 7th grade next year?
Exactly. So we're adding a grade on every year. So 6th, 7th, 8th, all the way up to every year.
Up to what?
Up to 12.
Oh, excellent. So in time, your school will really be large, much larger than it is now.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that we're going to be a precision teaching hub, to where we're able to quickly and efficiently identify kids who need help, provide the interventions and assessments at a real succinct level. So I'm just excited where this could go.
Well, I certainly will echo what I said at the beginning, and thank you for all of your efforts on behalf of the students. I'm sure when you're a teacher, oftentimes you don't get that direct thanks from the students, but people afar can see what you're doing, and teaching is a noble profession, and what you're doing down there is just really fantastic work. And listening to everything that you're doing, coming up with innovative solutions, that just is the precision teaching way. So you are making precision teachers proud everywhere, Shawn.
I appreciate that, Rick.
Well, I wanted to thank you for taking time out of your spring break and out of your day to speak with me in the audience, and I wish you luck.
Okay, thank you, Rick.
All right, thanks, Shawn. Well, that wraps up the interview with Shawn Datchuk, and that also brings us to an end of the May Precision Teaching Podcast. And as usual, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me. And I really appreciate those who have been giving me the positive feedback through emails. And until next month, I will see you then.